Good morning. Good morning to those of you in Western Canada. Good afternoon in Central and Eastern Canada. Currently, we're experiencing a winter wonderland. It's almost a whiteout, so I wish you all better weather where you're located. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rhonda Singer, and I'm your moderator for this HireImmigrants.ca webinar. I invite you to sit back, relax, and listen to what I think is going to be a very, very informative session. Before we start, for some of you that may be new listeners, HireImmigrants.ca is an initiative of allies, a joint project of Maytree and the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation. HireImmigrants.ca provides employers with the tools and resources necessary to help source, recruit, and retain skilled immigrant talent. The website HireImmigrants.ca features good ideas, practical tips that improve HR practices, help hire from a wider and a deeper pool of talent. We also regularly conduct webinars like this one to share promising practices and to facilitate learning across different regions and sectors. So today's 60-minute webinar focuses on accommodating religious diversity in the workplace. As many of you know, there is a legal mandate to accommodate religious practices. However, accommodation shouldn't only be a requirement. It's just good human resource practice to create an environment that recognizes religious practices of all employees. A company can improve their employee satisfaction and engagement by helping employees feel like they're being acknowledged and valued no matter what their religion is. So today we're joined by employers from all sizes and sectors, regulatory bodies, immigrant employment councils, and immigrant serving organizations, and representatives from government, all three, federal, provincial, and municipal levels. In fact, we have participants from 6 provinces across Canada. So welcome to everyone. As with previous HireImmigrants.ca webinars, this presentation will be recorded and made available online for those unable to join us today. Or if you'd like to review and share any part of this presentation with your colleagues, it will be available. Today we're going to hear from 3 experts on accommodating religious practices. I'd like to introduce David McKechnie, Partner, Employment and Labor Relations for McMillan, Irit Kelman, Human Rights and Health Equity Specialist at Mount Sinai Hospital, and Debbie Pawelczyk, Senior Advisor, Workplace Accommodation, Employee Relations, RBC. A warm welcome of appreciation and thank you to the 3 of you for joining us. So we're going to ask our panelists to respond to some of your questions during the Q&A session following this initial part. And we intend to leave enough time to make sure that we do get some of your questions. But just as a warm-up and to get a sense of who's in the audience, first we have a poll. So I want to ask everyone, this poll is now on the screen. Does your workplace have a religious accommodation policy? Yes or no? Whether the numbers are going to stabilize for a little bit, they're jumping around. Interesting, a little bit more happening. It looks like there certainly is more of a majority who do have a policy. And so hopefully for that group, we can support you with some new ideas in strengthening and implementing it. And for those of you who don't, I think you'll find this very helpful. So let's now turn to our panel. David.
Hello.
This question is for you. It's on the screen. David, what's an employer's obligation to accommodate religious practices and beliefs in the workplace? And what does that law really stipulate?
Well, as most of the people on the call probably are aware, each province and territory has human rights legislation that covers religion as a protected ground. And of course, the federal employers who are subject to the Canadian Human Rights Act, religion is also covered under that legislation. And really, what the law requires is that where an employee's belief or practices comes into conflict with a workplace rule or standard, such as hours of work, dress code can come up, scheduling, etc., an employer is required to accommodate to the point of undue hardship. Well, as we engage in our discussion this afternoon, in thinking about sort of the legal requirements, there's a few things to keep in mind. The legislation, none of the legislation, define religion. And so what has happened is the Supreme Court of Canada has provided us with some parameters, and I'll just try to give you a layman's perspective on what those parameters are, but it's a practice or belief that is connected with religion, which requires conduct that is either objectively or subjectively required by the employee in order to participate in that religion. And there's a couple of two key facets of that, those parameters. One is the practice or belief does not have to be part of a dogma or conform with the position of a religious official. So just because it's not on the church's calendar does not mean that it's not a religious belief or custom that's entitled to protection. The other requirement as part of the parameters is it has to be a sincere belief. The employee must sincerely believe the practice or custom is necessary. The other point that we need to keep in mind is when we're talking about accommodation is to the standard of undue hardship, and that is a very high standard. It's difficult to meet, and it must go beyond a mere inconvenience or temporary upset in the employer's operations. It's something that has to really affect typically the safety of other employees or the employee himself, or goes to an economic level that is quite severe. The other thing I want people to keep in mind is when you're dealing with accommodation, whether it's religious belief or any other ground under the Human Rights Code, the employer is required to provide reasonable accommodation, not preferred accommodation. So as we talk about some of the challenges that employers face in dealing with religious accommodation, just keep in mind that we're looking for reasonable accommodation as opposed to what the employee's personal preference may be.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for setting the stage in terms of where the obligation is. So let's move on to, I think there was about 40-some% who have not implemented a policy. The question then for those in particular are, what are the benefits to a company having a policy and then accommodating those religious practices in the workplace? So Irit, can we start with you?
Sure. There's a number of benefits. One is that by having a policy, you can actually start to proactively and also in response to particular requests, begin to remove some barriers that may actually be preventing some job seekers from wanting to join your organization. Having a policy makes a statement that everyone is welcome into the organization, and you're working towards creating equal access and opportunities. And from an organization's perspective, that actually enables you to access the best talent from a much broader pool that is available. It can also create respect for diversity internally within the organization, which can really result in a better working environment for everybody. It allows staff to bring their whole selves to work, so they don't feel like they have to spend time and energy hiding part of their identity. They can actually spend their time and energy focusing on their work and contributing to the workplace. And then finally, I would say having a policy means that everyone has, or at least should know, what the proper process is to follow, both if someone needs to make a request for accommodation and also for those who are receiving the requests, so that everyone knows their rights and responsibilities and that there's a consistent process followed.
Okay, great. That's helpful. Debbie, can you add to that from your perspective?
Yes, as Irit had mentioned, it allows a lot of consistency, respect, and around valuing diversity. I know at RBC, diversity for growth and innovation is one of our values, so that we want to make sure that we're committed to having an inclusive work environment, and at the end of the day, I just think it's the right thing to do.
Okay. Given that sort of umbrella, if somebody was going to start, or those of you who already have a policy in place, who typically are the players involved in creating a policy on religious accommodation in your experience? So David, maybe we'll just start from you. Anybody in particular that you've experienced?
So, for me, I get involved as a lawyer reviewing the policy, and when I'm asked to review these types of policies, the people I expect to be involved in developing them, obviously human resources who have some familiarity with the area, but it's also important to involve people on the operational side who may be asked to implement accommodations and try to get understanding of what sort of history we have with these kind of accommodations, what has been successful, what has been unsuccessful, and what can we do from an operational standpoint. It's not necessarily that we need that input to create and draft a policy, but in terms of thinking about how it's going to be implemented, it's really important that you have buy-in from the people who are going to be on that front line, who are going to be receiving these requests and who are going to be asked to change schedules or modify somebody's hours, so that they understand what the obligations are, but also how can we achieve not just to have a nice policy on paper, but one that's going to be effective in the workplace.
Okay, so that's a good overview. Debbie, would you give us maybe a better understanding how you have implemented in your organization?
Certainly.
Who are the players in terms of starting that implementation?
Right. So at RBC, Employee Relations is responsible for creating all of our workplace policies. So that would encompass human resources. We do have a lot of businesses stakeholdered at the table so that they're aware of our duty to accommodate. And then the final approval goes up to our Chief Human Resources Officer.
And Irit, what happens at Mount Sinai?
So in this case, it would be a joint. So for the accommodation policy, it was our office, the Human Rights and Health Equity Office, that took the lead on it. But we made sure that we consulted with human resources, as well as our numerous unions that represent employees in the workplace, and senior management and leadership. So, we're sort of a medium to large size organization. We've got the benefits of having those resources. So in terms of just some information back to some of the participants who may be coming from smaller organizations, I would suggest that if you don't have your own in-house expertise, then if you are going to draft your own policy, I would definitely suggest that an expert reviews it before finalizing it. So whether it's an external HR person or an external lawyer.
Okay, good advice, and that ties in very nicely to what David said. So moving on, and so now I think we're delving a little bit deeper to what are some of the key components that should be included in any policy on accommodating religious practices or observations. So Irit, would you start and maybe explain from your perspective what you've experienced around some key components?
Sure. So I think I would, in our policy, and we find this helpful, is that we start with a statement of principles or purposes so that it's clear what goals the policy is trying to achieve. So some of the goals would be some of the benefits that Debbie and I spoke about initially. So for example, that we welcome everyone in the workplace regardless of the religion, that we want to remove barriers to provide equal access and opportunities to the workplace. We're about creating a climate of respect and inclusion for all employees. And again, it is a legal requirement, and so in fact, a failure to accommodate can constitute discrimination. The procedures are really important. One of the things that is interesting about accommodation is there's been a lot of discussion out in the case law about a procedural duty to accommodate as well as a substantive duty to accommodate, and what that means is that even if at the end of the day the answer is no, we can't accommodate, you still need to make sure that you've gone through the appropriate procedure, asked the right questions, involved the right participants, and that it's been a cooperative process. So, it's important that employees, that the procedures specify how and when and to whom requests should be communicated, what might need to be verified and how. So, the obligation on the employee to provide some information, what the limitations are to accommodation, and the fact that it's a joint process, that all sides, all parties are expected to cooperate and be flexible and creative in trying to come up with an accommodation. We also found that it was helpful to have specific examples of some of the more common types of accommodations. So the more common accommodation requests, and then what some potential solutions are, some best practices that can be used as a guideline. And, the key thing, I think, as well is to indicate that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. An accommodation, it's very individualized. So an accommodation that works in one circumstance may or may not work in another circumstance.
I appreciate that last point in particular, because I think often organizations struggle with whether that is a possibility. Debbie, is that something you've experienced, and would you talk about how you've implemented, what kind of components you've used at RBC?
Certainly. As Irit was saying, actually, a lot of ours is very quite similar. We just need to make that statement that we're going to make all of our reasonable efforts to grant requests for religious leaves, where and working would put an employee in conflict with their religious obligations. As Irit once again had said, everybody's so different, and we need to take accommodation into account for each individual file that we look at. I think the accommodation process needs to be clearly documented as well, along with both the managers and the employees' responsibilities. And working collaboratively together is always the best way to accommodate. The employer really needs to be flexible, to think outside of the box, because as Dave had mentioned previously, employers are held to a very high standard, and they usually bear the burden of demonstrating that a serious effort has been made to accommodate. So if an accommodation request happens to be denied, an escalation process is a critical piece or a component as well.
Debbie, are you able to give maybe a couple of examples that you've experienced? And maybe it would be interesting to hear that from Irit before we get to David and from a legal place.
Just trying to think off the top of my head. I know one individual had come in to us just with respect to a very new religion that they had chosen to participate with, and it was just kind of the whole learning practice that we went through with the managers and the employees, and working together with employee relations as well to ensure that the needs and the religious components of the belief of this individual were taken into account, as well as the business. So it was a very unique situation.
It sounds like it, yes. Irit, just to go back to you, do you have any examples that you might be able to share with us?
In terms of specific accommodation requests?
Yes. Because that was, I think that's often one that comes up in my experience as well. So people are challenged with, so.
Yeah, I mean, a typical one that comes up is requests for specific days off for either religious observance for a holiday, or because somebody's religion prohibits them from working on one day a week. And in a sense, being, I work at Mount Sinai Hospital, for the most part, most of the jobs are 24/7 operation. It's shift work. And so that having that flexibility then actually makes that kind of accommodation, which may be more difficult in other workplaces, makes it a bit more flexible here. So if somebody requires Sunday off, then maybe they can trade with somebody else who either requires or prefers to have the Saturday off. So being able to have that that flexibility. I know that in my previous role at another organization, we had some quite unique requests with some religions that aren't as mainstream as others, and one of the religions prohibited participation in some celebrations that were being done as part of a child care center. And so just really working through the process, because sometimes, especially when managers and supervisors aren't familiar with a request or maybe personally disagree with what the religious practice stands for, really trying to help them to step back and move through the process objectively and not have their personal opinions be superimposed onto the process and onto making sure that those opinions don't influence the end decision.
It sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong from both of you, that this is not, when you come to that specific accommodation, not sort of a snap decision, that both organizations have really taken the time to work through the process and understand from both the employee's perspective, their obligation, and I suspect the culture and values of your organizations. Would that be correct?
Yes. Well put.
Thank you. So David, just for you from maybe a legal perspective, or please weigh in again from your experience on what are some of the components that you think or have experienced that should be included in any policy?
Well, and I just want to pick up on a couple of things that Debbie and Irit said that I completely agree with. The main one being process. There are a number of cases where the accommodation requested could not be implemented, but the employee was successful in challenging the process. It is very important when you're designing these policies to consider what the process is going to be, who's going to be responsible for reviewing the request, for implementing the request, and ensuring that, again, there is an objective evaluation that sets aside, somebody's, preconceived notions of what either a religion is or a religious observance is. There's certainly a number of cases where you're dealing with what I will call, well-known, non-standard religions, where the sincerity of the belief is not in question, but there's a lack of understanding on the employer as to, what actually is required as part of this belief or custom. And employers need to be aware that they can ask for further information, not necessarily to challenge. I'm not trying to set up an adversarial, but a learning opportunity to understand, what are the parameters of the belief or the custom that's fueling the accommodation request. And how can the employer manage its operations in order to make that accommodation. The other thing, just finally with respect to process and in your policy, it is important to know that it is an individualized process. So you have, we can design a wonderful policy, but there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all. So in terms of your process, you want to follow that, but at the same time, when you're thinking about, all the possible options you have in terms of accommodating somebody, you need to really make sure that you're dealing with the individual as opposed to what we do for everybody else.
Oh, great. Thank you. That was, I think that helped to expand this question really well. You mentioned something new, and I'd be interested. You mentioned evaluation, and just quickly, I'm interested in what that might look like. I think organizations are busy, and it's hard to go through evaluation. Is this what might that look like? Just quickly, David, in your is there like a one-page evaluation, or what? I mean, how do organizations evaluate the success of this policy typically?
Well, I think the key is that it's an ongoing process. So when you're looking at how has this been implemented, you need to consider past practice, but also for 1 year it may work. Another year, the accommodation you have may not work, and whether that's just because there's a shifting time period, shifting custom, there's a myriad of reasons why the accommodation that you tried may no longer be reasonable for the employee. So you have to go through this process, but you also have to understand that it may not end just with one decision. It may be something that you try once, it didn't work, you have to go back, and it could be either from the employee's perspective or from operations perspective that the offered accommodation just isn't suitable at the time.
Okay, thank you. Just quickly, Irit or Debbie, do you have anything to add about the evaluation around this? Is it just something you document? Do you evaluate? I'm just curious. Just a quick response would be great.
Yeah, actually, from an RBC perspective, we don't usually look at an evaluation. From a disability perspective, we actually do. We get input from both the manager and the employee, but we haven't implemented anything from a religious accommodation standpoint.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So Mount Sinai in our, we don't have a specific religious accommodation policy. We have just a general accommodation policy that would refer to all human rights grounds. And part of the procedures is actually monitoring. So there's an expectation that between 3 to 6 months after the initial accommodation has been put into place, that there's a meeting with the person being accommodated to verify that their needs are being met. And there's also a requirement that on an annual basis, there will be a verification, again, with the person that the accommodation, that first of all, they continue to require that same accommodation and that the accommodation continues to be appropriate. And it would be expected that those would all be documented.
Great. Okay, thank you. That helps. So, question, how do you implement a policy effectively? Like, how do your employees learn about it? As an example, how do you train managers in the policy success factors? What have you done? Debbie?
Yes. So I think one thing that's key here is the communication strategy. Get the news out there and raise the awareness. We have ours located on our intranet site that's totally accessible to everyone. Once again, we try to get our leaders talking about diversity and inclusiveness and kind of having them be our advocate because we seem to get more impact, I would say. You know, and that flexibility, thinking outside of the box and everything, and when everyone is aware that, you know, religious differences are being observed, they can, I think it was Irit that had mentioned it earlier, they can bring their whole selves to work. And so that's what that we have used.
Okay, great. Thanks. Irit, anything you want to add to that?
Sure. You know, I do want to acknowledge that particularly in the healthcare sector and probably in other sectors as well, it is really challenging to get all of our policies and procedures communicated out there because, you know, everyone, frontline employees, supervisors, managers, are struggling on a daily basis to try and understand and implement so many important policies and procedures. And in healthcare as well, all the regulated health professionals also have their own codes and policies and practices that they have to follow. So, you know, having a multi-pronged communication and training strategy really helps so that they're getting the same message from multiple forums and over a period of time. I agree with Debbie that communicate senior leadership, you know, walking the walk, talking the talk and walking the walk is really important in terms of showing leadership, especially where there might be some resistance to some of the policies. Making sure that accommodation issues are incorporated into other training. So not just human rights specific training, but, you know, any HR training on recruitment, on testing, things like that, having information on the web. You know, again, if it's something that there may be resistance to or it's completely new, you could, you know, do a poster campaign. We do that sometimes here as well. We have mandatory leading equity training for leadership, and accommodation is one of the components on there. And, you know, and then from a more practical perspective in terms of success factors, you know, it really needs, the policy needs to be applied consistently, and that way everybody knows that it's reliable and it feels fair. Even if they don't get the answer that they want at the end of the day, at least they feel that the process has been followed.
Great, good way to end up on that question. So moving on to the next question, which is a bit of a double one. We did talk a little bit about some of the common challenges, or at least one of them, that employers face in accommodating religious practices. But maybe you might be able to mention another one and what you've done to overcome that particular challenge. David, is there something you'd like to say here?
Well, the one I get most from my clients that I work with is when you do get a request from an employee that stems from a religion that is not one that the employer is familiar with. So the question is, how far can you go in, or even whether you can investigate the sincerity of the claims? And I mean, the answer is yes. As an employer, you can investigate the sincerity of the claims, but you have to do so in good faith. Pre-internet, I'm not sure what most people did, but now there's obviously a lot of information, and the employer should make sure that they are not just accepting every request blindly, that they are ensuring that it is a bona fide request. But there's obviously a lot of sensitivity and nervousness for employers when getting into this area, just as there are in any kind of accommodation issue. So doing research, speaking to people who are knowledgeable about the particular religion, about the custom, trying to understand the parameters, obviously speaking to the employee, trying to get more information as to where the belief or the custom is coming from and how it relates to the workplace. It is important, and it is something that the employer can do, and often they're nervous to do so.
Okay, thank you. Irit, something, maybe a specific example if possible, again, around a challenge and what you did to overcome it? And just in a quick one?
Sure. I guess generally the challenge I was going to talk about was the impact on coworkers, because some employees may feel that a person who's receiving a religious accommodation, they might actually feel that it's special treatment, especially if it's, if there's a change in terms of days off or scheduling change. So some of the ways that we would overcome it are, really focusing on the ongoing education to the staff. We would take maybe a combination of a harder approach and a softer approach. So the harder approach would be focusing, it's the law, we've got no choice. This is just, we accommodate, whether, and it doesn't, people's personal agreement, disagreement, religious, their own religion doesn't matter. It's a process, it's a law, we do it. And then the softer approach, which goes back to what Debbie and I talked about in terms of the benefits, and also, sometimes appealing to people's self-interest that, there are many grounds of accommodation, and every single one of us may, at some point in our careers, actually need an accommodation. So it's a good thing to have. We may want to rely on it one day, and it's just a good business practice. And then, that it's helpful if the chosen accommodation is one that meets the individual's needs, but also is the least disruptive to the workplace and to coworkers. And Dave had mentioned that it's a reasonable accommodation, not necessarily the employee's preferred accommodation. So it's the specific restrictions that need to be accommodated, and so there might be a creative way of doing that.
Good. Okay. Thanks. And Debbie, to finish up with this. Common challenges and how you might have overcome it at RBC.
Right. I know we had one individual had come into us requesting accommodation, and the manager was quite concerned of the impact that it was going to have on the business. We weren't, I guess, well-versed in the religion, so we have actually a couple of external vendors that we use. One provides our multicultural calendar. So we went back to them to help us gain some information, as well as we asked the employee to go back to the head of their faith, whether it be a priest or a rabbi or whatever it happens to be, to help us, get more information and get a better understanding. So with this extra information from both these two sources, we were better to accommodate the employee while still keeping the business needs in mind as well.
Good balance. Thank you. So I want to go into a slightly different approach now to go to say, if we're going to complement the religious accommodation policies in your workplace, what other supports can you provide to employees to increase their cultural competence? This nothing happens in isolation, and you talked about really, making sure it wasn't in silo. So, Irit, could you give us some comments or some examples about what you've done?
Yes. So, we've included the information about accommodation and religious accommodation as well as others in a number of different trainings. The obvious kind of human rights and harassment training, leading equity, but also we do some communication and managing conflict workshops, and we make sure, because we want to make sure that, when people have conversations about these issues, that they're able to do so in a respectful and productive way. It would be unnatural to say you can't ever talk about religion or your personal things in a work setting, but if it can be done, if people have the tools and skills to do so in a way that is, educated and productive, then that's a good thing. We also try and incorporate and embed human rights issues and diversity issues into other training, because other policies aren't applied in a vacuum. They're being applied to real people who have different layers to their identities, and so just making sure that those are taken into account in all of the policies and training we find are helpful. And then two unique things I just wanted to highlight that Mount Sinai is doing. We conducted an employee census, and we were looking both at demographic questions and also workplace environment questions. And so once we finish analyzing the data, we're hoping that we're actually going to be able to tell how differently the workplace is experienced by individuals based on their human rights protected groups. Which groups are the most impacted, and that'll put us in a much better position to be able to direct strategies to address those issues. So again, it's all about increasing the diversity and a better workplace. And then the last thing I'm going to let everybody know about, and I can share the website link, is Mount Sinai we've initiated an ally campaign, and what that's about is we're doing education and support and encouraging all staff to speak out if they hear inappropriate comments. And we've started focusing on 5 human rights protected groups. And the point is that to be an ally that means that you're not a member of those groups, so you're not experiencing that kind of discrimination on that ground, and therefore you've got a responsibility to speak out, to use your privilege to make the workplace a better place for everyone. And we've got posters, we've got videos, we've got e-learning, we've got a website with some great resources. So I can provide the link and if anyone's interested.
Okay, thank you. Debbie.
Yes, we once again incorporate a lot of this into our managerial excellence trainings that are going on. I know recently we're starting to talk a lot more about unconscious bias and things like that. So new training is going to be coming out for both managers and employees with respect to that as well. We also have an employee resource group called Mosaic that it started, I think, about a couple of years ago now, and it really they really build awareness and share information on how to share differences and kind of align with our RBC values. We also have different diversity celebrations throughout the year at different locations so that employees can share information about their culture and their religious and just once again building awareness.
Great. Well, lots and lots of good information and suggestions there for our listeners. Just before we go to the last question, I would like to invite the listeners to type in your questions. Start thinking about them, and because we're going to finish up with one last question. And Debbie, I'm going to ask you to start with this next question. If some employers are starting to think about and create these new policies on religious practices in the workplace, and even if those who are already in place, what advice would you give them? So let's start with you, Debbie.
Okay. I would start with ensuring that the roles are clearly defined, that we can't take a cookie-cutter approach to religious or any other type of accommodation. It's really on a case-by-case basis. we need to make sure that the communication strategy is such that everyone, has access to the information on the process of how to go through the accommodation, as well as that escalation process. I'd really recommend engaging as many parties as possible so that everyone is aware of kind of what their duty to accommodate is and the best way to go about accommodating religion in the workplace. So it's really that awareness and getting everybody at the table so everybody's aware of the process, procedures, and the responsibilities.
Okay, great. Thank you, Irit. What would your advice be to our listeners?
So I think if anyone's starting from scratch, I would, ask around at your fellow employers and see what policies they have. The local human rights commissions are also usually excellent sources of information. So here in Ontario, we have the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and I just took a quick look at their website today. They have an e-learning on duty to accommodate. They have a number of fact sheets on religious rights and discrimination, and then they have a publication that's called Human Rights at Work. Now, it was last updated in 2008, which I guess we're going on several years, but it's actually an excellent resource, and I've been recommending it for several years to people to take a look at. It's very in-depth, and you don't need to read the whole thing. You can just go through the table of contents and click on the specific topic of interest. And the other thing to be aware of is that, once the policy's done, and I guess this would be true for all policies, but you're not necessary. You want to make sure that you're staying up to date. So human rights is, there's ever evolving concepts, and things are always happening in the case law. So just to make sure that the policy acknowledges that, to make sure that you're paying attention to some of the big changes, and then update the policy accordingly, and to make sure that the policy and the procedures really highlight the requirement to be flexible and cooperate and to work together to try and achieve an outcome that meets everybody's needs.
Good advice too. All right, Dave, you have the last piece of advice comes from you.
So I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, it's tough to start from scratch, and you don't have to. There are a number of policies that are available on the internet that you can start using as a source. I do think it's important to involve legal counsel, to have an overview of the policy once it's designed. Either at the beginning to understand what should be included, but if you already have a broader discrimination policy, you're really working from there. But at the end of the process, to think about getting legal to sort of bless that policy, but also thinking about how it's going to be rolled out. Like I said, I have a number of situations where there is a policy in the books, but it isn't active and live in the workplace. Nobody knows that it's there. It was referenced when somebody was hired and never talked about again. I think it is good practice to make sure that they're putting these policies in front of employees on a regular basis, that you're providing training, and that you are keeping up to date on changes in either legislation or just quick cases, because this is a very active area, both at the tribunals and a very big source of opinion and interpretation of this area is in labor arbitrations, as labor arbitrators can interpret human rights legislation. So understanding sort of the scope and the parameters of the accommodation obligation and what sort of practices and customs have been dealt with before is very important, as not only when you implement, but also as you go back to that policy to deal with individual requests.
Okay, thank you. That kind of brings us, I think, full circle. And so now it's time for our listeners to type their questions into the question box in the center of your screen. And while we're waiting, I'm going to start with a question that I often experience. What is the difference between a cultural observance and a religious observance? Who wants to take a stab at answering that one first?
I'm happy to take a first shot at it. Thinking it from it as a lawyer, the key is the connection to a religious observance. there may be cultural events that occur, either festivals, parades, days off, that don't have that tie-in with a religious observance, with a custom or a belief. So, to me, a cultural observance doesn't have any protection under human rights legislation unless the employee can demonstrate that there is a connection to a religious faith.
Okay, thank you. Good beginning there. Irit or Debbie, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think it's how. Oh, sorry. It's kind of how it's how the cultural observant is tied to the religious observant. That's critical there, because otherwise it wouldn't be covered under the same grounds. But I just think we just need to kind of see what the tie is, to see if the two are to be looked at separately or together.
And from our perspective, I mean, we always encourage flexibility. So even if something doesn't fall right into that specific parameter, is there a way that need can be met that doesn't have a negative impact in the workplace? So there was an example where somebody's religious and cultural leader was coming to Canada, to Toronto, and this was a rare occurrence, and that person was very important to the individual. And no, it was not a religious obligation per se, but because of the importance to them and the sort of one-time unique nature, then we were able to work to allow the person to have that time.
Okay, thank you. That was helpful. We have another question here. What about the need, this is more specific, I think, for a space to pray? Does it need to be private for each person praying, or just a private room for anyone that wants to pray?
So here at Mount Sinai, before my time, there's a very creative solution, and we have what's called a spiritual oasis. So it's a room that's available to everyone, to staff, to visitors, to patients, and it's non-denominational, so there's nothing in the room decorative-wise or fixed that is specific to a religion, but there are there's cupboards within it, so there's there's different things that are in the cupboards that people may need in order to allow them to pray themselves, and so, but it's a room, it's a multifunctional space that people are to share.
Okay, great, thanks. Anybody else have anything else they want to offer on that?
Right. I know from within some of our larger major properties, we do have separate non-denominational rooms where the person can pray. Unfortunately, with all of our different locations and branches and things like that, we may not have a designated room, but we will try our best to make sure that there is a private location where the individual is able to pray.
Okay, so again, it depends on what you're able to do, but certainly lots of effort around providing some sort of space.
Well, and if I can just add one quick point to that, I mean, McMillan has done the same thing with respect to providing a room, but if the issue is that there needs to be, for this individual, it needs to be done in private, then, and it can't be in a shared space, then you're in the accommodation process, and you have to remember that it is an individualized approach. So having a private room may work for 95% of the workforce, and for 5%, there needs to be another look and see, is there something more that we can do, whether using an unused office, making some other space available for that individual at that particular time.
Okay, thanks. So I have another question here. How do you ensure that the source that provides the specific restriction that needs to be accommodated is accurate? We had an experience with an employee who provided us with a fake letter. Has anybody gone through something like that? How would you handle it? Silence. I can hear people thinking about this one.
Well, to me, it's the same as if you get a it's a misrepresentation. It's the same as if you get something from an employee that doesn't give you the information that you need. So, I think the question, there's two ways to look at the question is, whether it's a genuine belief or what exactly the parameters are. I mean, if it's a question about what the parameters are, then just as when you get a doctor's note, if it doesn't give you enough information to accommodate the request, you can ask for more information from the employee. If it's a question that, this has come from an invalid source, using third parties is the best way to go about trying to challenge the validity of the note, either through, obviously, I wouldn't say rely on Wikipedia, but, going back to, community groups who are connected with that faith, trying to get answers there. You really do have that right to question the sincerity of a belief if on a reasonable basis.
Okay, good. Thanks. Another question here. Has any of the speakers run into a situation where there are competing rights? And how have you handled that? So the question is around competing rights.
There aren't any that I can recall off the top of my head right now that we've had to deal with recently.
Okay, thanks. Debbie?
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I can't give you any examples of that either.
Okay. Let's move on to another question then. What are examples of accommodation outside of requests for religious days or holidays off or space for praying? Is there any other examples of accommodation that you could give examples to our listeners?
In terms of types of requests, clients of mine who are in the manufacturing space will sometimes get accommodation issues relating to, necklaces, jewelry, other items that are, expressions of sincere belief. But it sometimes becomes a safety issue. And sometimes it's very simple to deal with, either through using different safety equipment, but sometimes there cannot be accommodation because it poses a safety risk either to the employee or other employees.
Right. Health and safety, that's a good point to reference as well. Another really good question, I think, is what advice would the panel give on what not to do with regards to religious accommodation policy? So let's look at it from another perspective.
One area that I caution people on is not to automatically have one approach. So I have seen policies that were drafted saying, if you need accommodation, you'll have a day off, an unpaid day off. And it's already determined what the accommodation is going to be, and that's not acceptable because it is an individualized approach. And just saying that we're going to give you the day off but unpaid doesn't meet your duty to go through that process and to accommodate. So you want to be careful. Certainly providing examples is fine, and I always counsel my clients to give a menu of options approach so that the employee is involved in the process and is choosing an option that will work for them. This is both, I think, good for the employee, but also from a legal perspective, it's good because then you have the employee who's actually the one selecting and not the employer necessarily imposing the accommodation on the employee. So just be careful that you're not boxing yourself in the policy as to what the approach is going to be.
It sounds like the policy might be a little more general, which gives the practices that flexibility. So here's another question for you. How do you deal with the issues of dress code? For example, if an employee cites religious beliefs and wants to wear something that's not allowed by the company's dress code, that could tie to the health and safety issue. It could tie to something else.
I think that then the obligation would be to look at the policy, the dress code policy, and in order to not accommodate the person, then the employer would have to demonstrate that the dress code policy was bona fide occupational requirement, and there's a specific test to follow for that. And so, at the end of the day, they'd have to look at, is it absolutely required to meet whatever need? So is it about the kind of face that the company wants to promote? Well, that's probably not going to be acceptable, whereas once you start getting into safety issues, then it may. But there still needs to be some flexibility. So, for example, in the hospital, there's an issue of head coverings in certain sterile areas. And so, the hospital had to look at its policy and say, well, some people bring in their own personalized head coverings anyway that are not religiously based. Therefore, there would be no reason why people whose head coverings are religiously based can't also do that, as long as it meets certain criteria. It's clean, it's freshly put on in a certain area and then taken off and exchanged in a certain area. Or, they can wear disposable head coverings that the hospital provides on top of their own.
Okay, good example. Either one of you, does anybody else have another example around this question? Okay, I'm going to move on then to another one that's interesting as well. Can you shed some light on cultural, religious stipulated days after death in a family that can or maybe should be accommodated under religious obligations? Anybody have experience with that? So it's light on sort of cultural, religious stipulated days after death, the mourning period.
I'll jump in if no one else wants to. So again, I think it would be, it's all about the process. So, you'd go back to what is the individual requesting, how are they able to demonstrate that it's linked to their religion? What is the specific request in terms of, how many days off? Is it full days off? Is it partial days off? And then look to see, and once you've, if you can establish that it is a legitimate request, a sincerely held belief that's linked to the religion, then you would need to see, how can we accommodate and see whether or not you can. And again, as Dave had said, the only way that you can't is if you can demonstrate that you've reached undue hardship, which is a very, very high standard.
Okay, thank you. Irit, I know this has come up before. I just want to go back to something you said because I've been hearing a lot about this. You spoke about the census at Mount Sinai. How did you choose the questions you asked within legal limitations? And would you share those questions or maybe just speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, I'd need to check. I wasn't the lead on the project, but the Ontario Human Rights Commission encourages data collection. So it's one thing if you're in a job interview to ask someone what their religion is. That would clearly be prohibited. But to actually collect information from people on a voluntary basis so that you can then use it to improve the diversity and accessibility of your workplace is actually encouraged by commissions. And we asked a whole series of questions, and there was a long vetting process, but it touched on all types of human rights ground, from gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, race, disability. We covered most of them.
Okay, great. All right, so we're going to finish up here. Thank you. That was helpful. We have one last question, I think. Do all requests have to be granted? And who would I, connect to for guidance on this issue? I think you mentioned one or two resources before, but maybe you might just speak with that to that last question. Debbie, would you maybe?
Sure. I think in as many circumstances or as many cases as possible, once again, I think from an RBC perspective, we'll go as far as we can to accommodate. And once again, I encourage the collaboration between the manager and the employee to kind of sit down, have that conversation. What is possible, given the circumstances, and really try to work through the process to come up with something that's reasonable. to my knowledge, we have never come across something that has caused us undue hardship. So the manager is really encouraged to act in good faith, and we have, if the manager has questions, we have our group of HR consultants that we can go in and we can have like a very robust conversation to see how best we can accommodate our employees.
Okay, thank you. David, anything you want to end up?
Well, speaking as employer counsel, my view is no. All requests do not have to be granted, but we do go back to the undue hardship. So, for example, if somebody's faith says that they have to stand in a certain direction, they have to stand south every day during the day, and they work on a manufacturing line where they have to stand east, you're not required to change your manufacturing line and reorient your entire workplace. However, you probably would be required to look to see, well, are there other positions that the individual is qualified for that you could place that person in where they could meet that requirement. The thing I think we all need to keep in mind is there is a broad spectrum of customs and beliefs, certainly in our ever-expanding world and our multicultural workforce. So all requests do not have to be granted. All requests have to be respected and gone through the process to really understand, A, is it a bona fide request? B, is it something that we can accommodate to have an accommodation for?
The last word was to you. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, it's all the time we have for today, but a very rich discussion. So on behalf of the audience and higherimmigrants.ca, I'd like to acknowledge each of you, Dave McKechnie of McMillan, Irit Kelman from Mount Sinai, and Debbie Pawelczyk of RBC, for giving us your time and the benefits of your expertise and your experience. We really appreciate you providing us with such an insightful overview of the legal and the practical applications of religious accommodation in the workplace. And to you, our audience, thank you for joining us today. This webinar, as I said before, has been recorded. It will be available shortly, along with other past webinars on the higherimmigrants.ca website. We will send you a notice when it is available. Don't forget that the webinar and higherimmigrants.ca has a wealth of resources at your disposal, including success stories of various employers across the country on recruiting and hiring skilled immigrant talent. And so while you're there, if you haven't done it already, don't forget to sign up for our e-tips and receive some practical tips from employers and event notices. Finally, the last, please take a moment to fill out the survey and tell us what you thought of this seminar and what topics that you would like to cover in the future. The survey will appear on your screen momentarily. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.